the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. Sorry for the delay. There was a technical difficulty, but it wasn't with the technology, but rather with my own brain. I went into the wrong stream. But we're here today with James Smith and Alfie Bown. James Smith is the host of The Popular Show, or the co-host of The Popular Show. Alfie Bown, of course, is the editor of Sublation Magazine. I'm Douglas Lain, the guy at Sublation Media, the novelist behind Bash Bash Revolution. Later on, we will be talking to David Shields, whose book, How We Got Here, is coming out soon from Sublation Press. He'll be talking about Trump, but at the moment, the big topic is the victory of George Galloway. So, James and then Alfie, what do you guys think? What's your feeling about the James Galloway's victory? I mean, George Galloway's victory.
Do you want to start, Alfie?
Yeah, right then. Yeah, great. I mean, it's I don't know how much of a sort of surge it's made over there, Doug, but I think over here in the UK it's been quite big news. So that's why I suggested hopping onto an extra live show or making this the topic today and getting James on, because we'd been in the pub the day of the by-election results discussing it, and I thought James had some interesting things to say. But I have been like really interested today. Two things I've done today is look at where has been covering it and stuff, and it is quite interesting. Some of our sort of left rivals, there's an interesting piece in Unheard magazine by our own Sublation magazine and pamphlet author Ralph Leonard, which I disagree with and wouldn't mind coming to. And there's interesting coverage in The Guardian. James mentioned a few pieces as well. So I think there's a lot to discuss. But I don't know if it's worth just beginning with like a kind of brief sense of who George Galloway is, because over here he's been a huge figure, and probably less so over there, I don't know, but lots of it's forgotten and historic anyway. I mean, so basically, I mean, James, you might want to sort of come in a bit while I'm talking, because I don't know as much as I'd like to about it, but when I went to university it was 2006, and that was really at the height of Galloway's kind of first moment. And but although he's this Scottish guy, he's from Dundee, he's like a working class Scottish guy, maybe with an Irish mum and Muslim father or something like that. And he had been in the Labour Party for a lot of years, and he was extremely against the Blair years in general. Became a bit of an outcast in the Labour Party at that time. And then it all came to a head around the Iraq War, where he like really passionately opposed the war, and ended up being sort of thrown out of the Labour Party in 2000 and maybe 2004 or 2005 for this stuff. And he was then sort of called to the US Senate to answer this charge that he'd been having lunch with Saddam Hussein and all this stuff. And he sort of really stood up for himself again there, saying, I've met Saddam Hussein the same amount of times as Donald Rumsfeld, except Rumsfeld was selling guns and I was trying to argue for peace, and so he became, when I went to university in 2006, in very first day of very first week, there was Galloway on campus doing a talk, which wouldn't happen today, and it was all the leftists at the university that had gathered around or whatever. So he does have this kind of history as being this sort of hard left of the Labour Party. He supported Ken Livingstone, Jeremy Corbyn historically or whatever, Tony Benn. He's been part of this sort of pushing of the Labour Party to the left or whatever. However, on the other hand, he is ideologically discredited, shall we say, over a series of things. Firstly, the getting into bed with Saddam Hussein accusations. Secondly, his sexual promiscuity. He's a well-known sort of Lothario who sort of boasted a few times about his, carnal delights and things. And then he sort of humiliated himself by going on Celebrity Big Brother and pretending to be a cat. Are they the main discredit? Oh, he defended Julian Assange by saying that even if it was true, it still wasn't rape. This was another big thing years later. So he's got these sort of two histories, I suppose. One as being this kind of hard left activist, quite interesting Marxist. He also lobbied in the 80s, I was reading today, to have the Communist Party aligned with the Labour Party at the time. He wanted to connect with the Socialist Workers' Party at various points in his history. So he has this like interesting history as a hard left activist that wanted to pull the centre left further to the left. And then he's got this other history as being this sort of quite nefarious connections with, he has supported Iraq and various, quite inappropriate support for various things in the Islamic world, plus the sexual stuff. So he's got these kind of two histories. One is this kind of like discredited madman, and one is this kind of like activist of the sort of harder left. What do you think, James?
Well, before you go, I wanted to run a clip from, I guess, is this your prime minister? I can't keep track anymore. They keep getting thrown out. But yeah, the prime minister here has some things to say about Galloway, and here it is.
What started as protests on our street has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence. Jewish children fearful to wear their school uniform lest it reveal their identity. Muslim women abused in the street for the actions of a terrorist group they have no connection with. Now our democracy itself is a target. Council meetings and local events have been stormed. MPs do not feel safe in their homes. Long-standing parliamentary conventions have been upended because of safety concerns. And it is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP. There are four...
So, not a ringing endorsement from the prime minister. In fact, it seems that Galloway is considered to be an attack on democracy, and that his election represents some sort of deterioration of our politics. In fact, Ralph Leonard said something similar to that. James, what did you make of the prime minister's statement, and what do you think of Galloway?
Well, it's remarkable to me, Doug, that 1 year ago, George Galloway was on The Popular Show, and I don't know if that's in the good Galloway or the bad Galloway column, according to Alfie's description there. But a year ago, he was part of what Peter Hitchens refers to as the pariah left, the part of the anti-imperialist left that was campaigning against NATO escalation in Ukraine, and was basically, couldn't get a gig. He would organize a talk, and then there would be complaints to the venue, and he'd be kicked out. And he was a real outsider figure. And as I put it to St. George a year ago, when I was growing up, he was always on the TV. It's a sort of way of remembering that actually we live in a much more constrained media ecosystem today, a much more illiberal society, both in Britain and America today. Galloway was part of that Labour left with Tony Benn, with Jeremy Corbyn, and others who were tolerated actually by Blair up until Galloway took it a bit far as the Blair machine was concerned over Iraq. By and large, the socialist left was tolerated within the Labour Party during New Labour. Today, under Keir Starmer, as soon as you express anything that could be interpreted as socialist or anti-imperialist, you're out of the party. And Galloway couldn't get on mainstream TV. He was stuck on YouTube. Before the Russian channels were proscribed, he was having to go to them to get a gig. Here we are 1 year later, and he's winning elections, and he's back in Parliament. So really, I think the lesson is that it should remind us not to write anyone or anything off. We still live in the very unpredictable political circumstances of the long 2016. No matter how many efforts are being made by our elites to shut down the possibility of democracy, shut down the possibility of unexpected parties entering into the political as such, there are still cracks in the edifice, and Galloway represents such a crack right now. So I'll say from the start, Galloway has, not everything he does is what I do, but he has my unreserved congratulations and support in this candidacy and this victory. And I guess we'll get on to the variety of left reaction to it in good time. But that would be my central reaction. The other thing I wanted to say at sort of the head of this is that it's an interesting contrast with Corbyn, with the other sort of face and the other kind of figurehead and leadership for the left, such as it is in Britain today. The argument that I made in my book that I did for you, Doug, Other People's Politics, was it was actually very significant that it was Jeremy Corbyn who had gotten to lead the left at the national level, had gotten to have this potential and pretty well played for a while stab at state power. It wasn't any of the kind of traditional hard men of the left, the macho guys of the left. It wasn't the union leader Len McCluskey. It wasn't the ex-socialist mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. It wasn't John McDonnell, Corbyn's right-hand man, and it wasn't Galloway. It wasn't these kind of machismo, old trade union, hard guys. It was this sort of soft boy of the left, Corbyn, working on the allotment, quite kind of comfortable with identity politics. Back then, I was making the case that in the Corbyn years, that it was kind of significant that this was the guy who'd managed to get through, because it opened up the left to quite a lot of people who had been sort of put off by it. And it was only really under Corbyn that you could have a kind of millennial left with young women at the heart of it. I'm interested to see if a lot of the cohort who supported Corbyn because he was more of a kind of gentle, sensitive kind have now maybe kind of reassessed and thought, well, actually, Galloway might be a bit of a dick in various ways. Maybe I don't like some of the things he's done, but the difference is this guy wins. This guy keeps getting written off. He keeps coming back and he keeps winning with no party machinery, no big donations. Where's it coming from? He is somehow the sort of stubbornness and a pretty old-fashioned machismo actually does seem to be an ingredient of left populism that can still get results.
Well, we'll return to the surprising nature of his victory and some of the factors that went into it in a bit. But I wanted to ask you, James, a bit about Galloway as a canceled figure.
Yeah.
Because, I have a soft spot for those who've been canceled. I've been ratioed before. I don't think I've ever been canceled. But Galloway is an interesting figure on that front. He was involved with the Bately Grammar School controversy, wherein a teacher was suspended for using the Charlie Hebdo cartoon depicting Muhammad as a teaching tool, and that led to the teacher's suspension, as I guess some Muslim students or others felt offended by being shown that cartoon. That was a cartoon that led to the mass murder of employees at Charlie Hebdo by a terrorist organization. George Galloway released the following statement after the Bately Grammar School. This is in leaflets, I'm assuming from his the Workers' Party. He said, "I will campaign for religious freedom and for the freedom of religious people not to have their faith or their prophets maligned and ridiculed." So from my perspective, his position on free expression is aligned with Orban's in Hungary. The Hungarian constitution stipulates that the right to freedom of expression may not be exercised with the aim of violating the dignity of the Hungarian nation or of any national, ethnic, racial, or religious community. Persons belonging to such communities shall be entitled to enforce their claim in court against the expression of an opinion which violates the community, invoking the violation of their human dignity as provided for by the act. So my question is, to what degree do you think Galloway has a socially conservative perspective that is illiberal, and is his commitment to anti-imperialism a commitment to some sort of traditionalist? I mean, the Huntington thesis of war civilizations, the war between civilizations, is wrong, but that doesn't mean that everybody knows it. So does Galloway see this, his championing of the Palestinians or of the people in Iraq, as taking up the defense of traditional cultures against modernity?
I don't read it that way myself. I mean, the fallout of the Charlie Hebdo attack and attendant controversies in schools and in media was a decade ago now. I don't. He's slightly changed his base and his strategy. He has incorporated elements of the Trump strategy actually into his program, and now describes himself as attempting to unite working class Muslims and working class whites in some of the areas of the country, such as Rochdale, where there has historically been kind of tensions between these communities. So I don't think that he's somebody who's going to reward us trying to find a kind of coherent and consistent single thread of principle through his political career, which has been opportunistic and has been based on identifying where there is a crack or a possible surprising coalition to be formed. That said, I think that there is a matter of principle when it comes to Britain's Muslims and when it comes to anti-imperialism. We have to bear in mind that the Labour Party that George Galloway was kicked out of was advancing on an extraordinary McCarthyite agenda against Britain's Muslims, was introducing the Prevent program of an extraordinary level of interference and spying in the lives of ordinary people, and turning doctors, teachers, the entire public sector into an arm of the police and surveillance state to that end, all the while bringing Britain's foreign policy into accordance with the Atlantic one, with the American one, to a degree that no previous prime minister before Blair had ever done. Everyone had retained some autonomy on some level, and Blair completely dissolved that. So I think that Galloway, rather than being tested against, have you always been consistent on free speech? Is this your major principle? I don't think he would say that. I would say that he judges a situation in terms of what is important in the moment. And right then, it was a very, very authoritarian environment for Muslims. Nobody in mainstream politics was standing up for them. And Galloway recognized that it was a sort of low ebb as far as the socialist left was concerned in the country. Nothing like what Corbyn could access in 2015 was there, and so he tended to take the Muslim side in most questions against both parties, both political parties, and against the vast majority of the mainstream media. So I think he's tended to see himself as defending the interests of a particularly maligned and a group that has been traditionally excluded from the political process, and that kind of links a domestic agenda of pushing back the surveillance state, pushing back over policing, etc., to a foreign policy agenda of ending Britain's engagement with forever wars and ending engagements, Britain's support for unsupportable political situations abroad.
Well, I want to say something to that, and then Alfie, I know you've been waiting you want to chip in, but it seems to me that now I wasn't in the UK at that time, but if the policies of Britain mirrored the policies of the United States, and I'm pretty sure they did, it strikes me as it was a losing strategy at the time for the left to defend against the surveillance state and the infringement of basic due process and civil liberties on the basis of there being an oppressed group that particularly needed those protections, rather than it being a disintegration of the contract that people should have with the state, and that this was simply universally wrong. This would be the first thing I would say. So in that context, to pick out a cartoon of Muhammad as the and someone being fired from their job for teaching about Charlie Hebdo and censorship as the way to defend a Muslim community who's having their own civil liberties trod upon, strikes me as perverse, and I think a losing strategy. But that's I just want to make that comment on it. But Alfie, you go.
No, but I think that's sort of fair enough on that particular topic, Doug. I'm not sure if I really disagree, but I feel like we're getting slightly away from what's sort of important about this moment. And I think the discussion should not be, is George Galloway a good guy or a consistent guy? Because that's why I sort of started with these two histories, right? If you want to start looking for the dirt, this is not going to take you very long. So
a lot easier than Corbyn. It took them a couple of years to work out what to say about him. Galloway's easy.
Exactly. But as you called the title of this, the meaning of George Galloway in the UK, the question is like, what actually is this a symptom of, and what does it suggest for us politically or whatever in this moment? And I think part of it, James touched upon with this question of left populism or whatever. One thing I found very interesting in what James said, and what the Guardian had reported about it, is this question about the Islamic and the white working class. I think that is something really interesting that's worth talking properly about. I mean, when I was much younger, I lived in Manchester and I was training for a marathon. And I used to, my marathon, it's about 13 miles from Manchester to Rochdale on the Rochdale Canal. And so my longest runs were to run down this canal and run back. And you really did see it was quite an eye-opening experience. I mean, my favorite parts of it were about halfway down in sort of Newton Heath. You get pubs that open at 7 a.m. and they're packed by 8 a.m. with drum and bass music and people drinking shots. It's really quite something. But in Rochdale, it is true that you see this, or this was 10, 15 years ago, this kind of divided community between, and it's a classic example of class politics being misdirected and redirected into race politics in order for the capitalist ruling class to avoid confronting the economic crisis in the place. And I think so you could visibly see this tension between the Islamic and white community working among the working class. On the other hand, you also find people hanging out together who have been friends who grew up in Rochdale, went to school together. Second generation effects of this movement is that some of our best friends might be white British or Islamic British, whatever, and the difference appears different. So I think it's very interesting that this has been Galloway's kind of claim here. And the Guardian article, the one you sent me, James, I thought was fascinating by what's the guy called? The journalist
Michael Chesham, who is a classic sort of Trotskyite imperialist, I would put it that way. He's just always there. No, Corbyn's got to support staying in the EU. No, we mustn't criticize NATO. No, you can't support Galloway. Anything that might win, you've got to be against it.
And his take basically is that Galloway tricked both sides. Basically, he played one card to the Muslims, saying, this is all about Palestine. And then he did the Trump stuff for the Brexit Britain people, saying, look, I don't believe I'm against, he's got some questionable comments about trans people. He even said, make Rochdale great again. So he was deliberately appealing to this. The take of the Guardian is he tricked both people by sending them different types of content to sort of get half his support from one, half his support from the other. That's obviously what the sort of centrist capitalist position would be, instead of the actual possibility here. What if they are receiving the same message? What if there is allies? What if that apparently unpalatable bedfellows can get into bed together over certain issues or whatever? And that's something that I think the left can see and say, okay, if that's happening, that's something that we would want to take on. And just a very last thing before I pass back, I think it relates a little bit to Ralph Leonard's much more interesting argument in Unheard, but that was basically focused around Galloway's perceived sectarianism. But, you know, today I revisited Galloway's history just on Wikipedia. I recommend everyone to spend an hour on Galloway's Wikipedia. But he's not really sectarian. He's always tried to bring different groups of the left in together. He has, even those, quite ostracized ones. He actually seems to have had the opposite instinct to always try to like bring unpalatable bedfellows. You know, that's an Orwell thing, in together. And I think that, those are the two things we can say that there are possibilities. Not that Ralph Leonard and the Guardian journalist aren't right in thinking there are some problems with this guy. It's not that you're not right to think, look, maybe he's got the wrong ideas here. Is there something interesting happening here that is important for the left or the populist left or whatever? And I think those are the examples where maybe there are.
For a very long time,
I want to. Okay, can I jump in here at this point just briefly to say two things? One is, and to ask a question. One is, like, you know, when you talk about Leonard's piece, it was titled "Is George Galloway's Sectarianism a Sign of Things to Come?" But it's important for people who are watching this channel to understand what Ralph Leonard meant by sectarianism. It was not that he was saying Galloway was a sectarian Marxist or was too committed to some Marxist dogma, but rather that he was playing a kind of coalition racial politics, which is very common in the United States, and, you know, kind of a balkanized approach to politics, exactly doing what I guess it sounds like the Guardian was saying, like, you know, trying to hobble together a coalition on different interests, but speaking to people through their ethnic identity, primarily, and their particular interests first, I think is what he was talking about in his Unheard piece. Now, my question is for both of you. My understanding is Rochdale has a 30% Muslim population, like 30% of the population is Muslim, and that Galloway won by 39%. I don't know what the voting participation rate was like between in the different demographics, but my question is, do you think that the Muslim vote in Rochdale was consequential? And then I have a follow-up to it, and I'll ask it now. The fact that the Labour Party abandoned their candidate and ostracized him for his statements around Palestine and Israel, do you think that was consequential in getting him elected? So those are the two questions I have for both of you.
It probably was consequential, and but I would take that as significant as well. The candidate that Labour were running was a hand-picked Starmer lackey, but it's not the first time that Starmer has started to come up against his own hugely illiberal censoriousness about what you're allowed to say in the Labour Party, a censoriousness that he introduced in order to get rid of the Corbynite left. This isn't the first time that it's his own allies that have ended up getting hoisted on that petard. So that should show us, like, the fact that, you know, they might, these Starmerites might reasonably complain, hang on, you made up those rules only to get rid of the left. How come they're applying to me as well?
What did this guy say that got him thrown out?
He had, I don't know what the direct quote is. It was reported as he had speculated about Israel's letting October 7th happen, which he might have got from the pages of the liberal Israeli press. I don't know how, you know, obviously there are maximalist and cautious ways of saying that kind of thing. Anyway, what it comes down to is a reminder that up until everyone got really hot about anti-Semitism and Corbyn, we used to have a much higher bar for free speech on Israel in this country, and right-wingers used to be able to criticize Israel when they wanted to, and now all of a sudden they're backed into a corner where no one quite knows what the rules are, because the rules have been totally rewritten in order to get rid of Corbyn. What I'd say, I mean, as for sectarianism, it should always prick up our ears and alarm us when people who have absolutely nothing politically in common end up making the same argument. So Ralph Leonard, as I understand it, sort of anti-woke, post-left, socially conservative left. Michael Chesham, ultimate student politics, woke leftist, pro-EU, pro-supranational bodies whenever he gets the chance. They're both making the same argument. What is it about Galloway that represents this sort of hard kind of barrier that makes these ostensibly opposed figures unable to just be normal about him? Why are both of them going to efforts to discredit him that they don't apply to either the prime minister or the leader of the opposition? What's special about this kind of dodgy left populism that needs to be stamped out because it somehow spoils the analysis both of the woke side and of the anti-woke side? I mean, I'd extend that question to Gaza in general, which I think, as we've discussed at length, Doug, has really shaken up the kind of intra-left political spectrum in quite an intriguing way.
Just on Ralph Leonard briefly, I have not heard him say or read anything that he's written that would indicate to me that he is socially conservative. And by that, but I do think that I think that he is he's kind of a contrarian on the left in so much as he is really for a universalist liberal, as in like classical liberal kind of politics developing into socialism. It would be what I would kind of project upon him, but I can't really speak for him. But I've not ever heard him say anything socially conservative.
The irony is that both of these people, who probably don't describe themselves as liberals in the first instance, they both describe themselves as socialists of some kind. Both of them are criticizing Galloway for being illiberal. Actually, he's being the most classical British liberal there is. In Britain, there's the principle of the Burkean MP. Edmund Burke in the 18th century said that as an MP, he was answerable to his constituents. He didn't follow the party line. He wasn't answerable to some kind of external ideology. He represented the view of the constituents. Now, this is a kind of liberal fiction, but actually it applies perfectly to Galloway. If we can accuse him of shifting his politics around, if we can accuse him of singling out this one constituency and defending their position and representing their views, well, that's actually, as socialists, we're critical of the British Constitution, but that is how the British Constitution is alleged to work. He's the most liberal figure in Parliament right now.
Well, that may be true. Go ahead, Alfie.
No, I was just going to respond quickly. A couple of quick things I thought of as you guys were talking. Just to add, one is I mean, the Ralph Leonard thing. We should be clear. It's a 600-word article, and he's a great writer. It's just a way of thinking about the different responses to Galloway. But the socially conservative point that came out there, I think is worth revisiting. It's not that we should argue here in the last 5 minutes about whether we think that we should have a left that's economically left and socially conservative. But the fact is, again, in terms of the meaning of George Galloway in the UK, it shows that there is potentially an appetite for a socially conservative economic leftism. And I've even seen, and that is very interesting, I've even seen people, pro-Palestine activists, being anti-Galloway in the last few days, because, of course, he's not couth enough. He doesn't match the sort of woke version of that form of activism that we see. But there might be another more interesting version. I'm not myself arguing here and now for a social conservatism that's left economically, but I don't think that it's stupid for us to notice that there might in fact be an appetite for that kind of thing, and that the left is giving away half of its potential voters if it only exists as socially left and socially and economically left. If it does not mind though that possibility, we're only half of the left, as it were. If you see my point.
My stance on Galloway, by the way, is that I'm critical, but I'm not anti-Galloway. And in general, I thought, because he's been canceled and he's a loudmouth, I always thought, it's worth listening to, because he's saying the things that are not being allowed to be said in that moment, right? Often enough. My question about him now is, if we, you said earlier, James, why don't we apply the same criticisms to the prime minister as we would to Galloway? Well, of course we should, right? I mean, and people like Ralph Leonard probably would, and people like the guy at the Guardian probably would not. But the question is whether or not, for me, is Galloway's victory represents a break from what I consider to be the kind of status quo politics and that I experienced in the United States. And the way it works in the United States is you'll have some outlier candidate win a small district or win a city here and there. You might have a wrestler get elected governor. And, they might have a populist appeal and they may be very strong on one or two issues, but the question is whether or not that is, organizing around Jesse Ventura. I mean, it's not a fair comparison because Jesse Ventura was not Galloway and was not standing as strongly as on some sort of anti-imperialist line, but nonetheless, organizing around that kind of figure, looking at that kind of figure as a bellwether, is that justified? That's my question. It's not should we condemn or laud Galloway, but how do we interpret his victory? And so to go back to the question I asked before about if the Labour Party hadn't withdrawn its support for Azhar Ali, would Galloway have won, or could they have taken that vote with that candidate? I think it's an important one because if you think they could have won with their own candidate in that district, then or in that town, then you might think, well, a not very substantive socialism, the kind that this guy who's a Starmerite from the Labour Party could muster together by appealing to identity issues and not by having a real plan to end the war between Israel and Gaza and to develop a integrated state or two-state solution, not by having a forward-looking vision, but simply having kind of rhetoric around the issue, could have won. Well, then maybe Galloway doesn't represent as much as we think, if we think that. But if you think Galloway represents something that the other guy couldn't have done, the Labour Party candidate couldn't have done, then I want to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, the Starmer candidates had said whatever, criticized Israel in some sort of in-person meeting, and then as soon as he was selected as the Labour candidate, he switched to the Starmer line that Israel's done nothing wrong and Keir Starmer's done nothing wrong. So he was just a sort of a party mouthpiece, really. Yes, I see what you mean. I mean, for me, the real answer is it's very unpredictable. I mean, there were people who were predicting that the far rights were going to win that Rochdale election, and actually they're nowhere at all. For those parts of the left who have a big priority about stopping the far right, actually here's a very interesting formula for how to do that with a Galloway-like program. I mean,
is the far right anti-Israel in the UK, or
no? They're very pro-Israel.
Well, there's your answer for why the far right wasn't going to win in Rochdale. They have a 30% Muslim, constituency, and they're pro-Israel more so directly and more visibly than the left and then Labour, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're sufficiently low profile as to be somewhat chameleon-like. Well, I wouldn't say they're more pro-Israel than Labour, actually. Labour are the most pro-Israel body in the country right now. But what I would say is that the Galloway campaign, much like the recent Gaza and current Gaza protests, what's distinctive about them is that we, the left, can pontificate and wonder about what the meaning of them is. But unlike most left adjacent activity of the last decade, the left isn't the driving force in these things. The Gaza protests would be happening whether the left were there or not. Galloway has been spat out and cancelled by the left, and it's only now that some people are starting to think, oh, well, maybe we were hasty, and maybe actually maybe some things can be forgiven here. Galloway, the Gaza protests, these are movements and projects that have overlap with traditional left interests, but they represent forms of political actor that have suddenly taken center stage, and what's the actual official left been doing, what have the post-Corbyn kind of bodies and platforms been doing? No, they've been playing catch up. And I mean, it's for everybody to decide whether they want to get behind a particular kind of movement in that, or whether they want to keep it at arm's length. But the point is that the game isn't up. There are still unexpected forms of political actor that are coming into play, and the effects of the Gaza issue are not simple. And for those people in the audience who sort of wrote this off as just another current thing, or just another kind of pet moral project for the left, I think they're mistaken. And I think that this is still, the kind of full meaning of this is still unfurling. And Galloway is showing one model for channeling something of this popular discontent and feeling into a kind of a left entry into state power in however modest a fashion.
What do you think of the Workers' Party, guys? But both of you.
I just say one quick thing on just really briefly on the back end of what James said and your question, Doug. I would have phrased the question a bit differently. Not can we use the Gaza situation to explain why this has happened, and therefore it's just a symptom of that, but rather, like, I'm not sure myself, as James said, these protests would be happening whether there was a left or not. I'm not sure whether these these Palestine protests are leftists, and they are leftist, and some aspects of them maybe and some don't. The question is rather, is there going to be any leftist result of this movement at all? And that's what remains to be seen. Are we going to come out of this huge wave of protests and see that there was a strand of leftism that was taking hold and getting somewhere, making a step forward through this movement? Or was it nothing at all? Was it just activism, no Marxism? Now, it remains to be seen. But the question is, isn't this an early hopeful example of where there may in fact be gains for the left out of the activist moment or whatever? Sorry, James, you go.
Well, what about the Workers' Party?
At the very least, I'll answer that. But at the very least, it has cut the cord as far as the sort of sheepdogging effect. The argument I know Doug's made many times, that the effect of Bernie was to sheepdog people into the Democrats. Oh, I hate Biden, but I still have to support them, and they're better than Trump. That's actually stopped. All of those, like, generation left, millennial, Bernie adjacent people, they're now willing to let Biden lose to Trump, and that's a negative gain, but that's much better for the psychology of our movement and the strategizing of our movement, even before we get to something that is important to me, which is the publicizing and the mobilizing of the fact that our countries should not be supporting what they're supporting in Israel. Different question that Doug and I have debated before. As for the Workers' Party of Great Britain, like almost everything Galloway does, it's just a sort of made-up vehicle. It's little more than a YouTube channel, as far as I can tell. That said, all the attention he's getting, all of the fact that I do think that ex-woke members of the Corbyn project are now sort of shrugging, as I've said in this discussion, and thinking, oh, maybe actually this guy does kind of get results, even if I don't like the dirty tricks he uses. But perhaps people will be wanting to run as Workers' Party of Great Britain candidates. And I mean, the tragedy is that you could actually have a very interesting Workers' Party if Corbyn would cross over and support Galloway. At the weekend, Galloway said, This is my invitation to Corbyn. You're still the one who's actually loved. You come join me. You'll be the leader. I'll support you. I doubt Corbyn will do it, but that's another kind of
that would be
way
exciting.
In which this is an opening. It would be exciting, and
and
I would all my naivety would come back, and I would
be terrible then. I hope he doesn't do it. I don't want your naivety to come back. So no, but so it sounds to me as though, well, first of all, I want to point out, you and I, when we debated, we were not debating whether or not the Israeli bombardment of Gaza was an atrocity or whether it needed to be condemned. I just want, we both agree on that. And I want to point that out. But what rather to degree to which the anti-war movement that was building up would be a path forward for socialism or not. That's what we were debating. I would love to be proven wrong. I mean, part of me hates being proven wrong no matter what, even if it's for the better, but I would love to be proven wrong. So yeah, it sounds to me like we're going to have to wait and see what happens with Galloway, but I do want to ask to what degree. I mean, look, the prime minister's speech about this, I thought, was abominable, terrible. The idea that you would condemn an election as anti-democratic, no matter
democracy must be defended against the voters, as usual.
That's right. Yeah, and then on top of that, in the same speech, he talked about how pro-Palestinian protesters or people protesting against the war in Gaza need to understand there's a limit, and that the police will be backed to the hilt, and that you can't flash anti-Semitic slogans on Big Ben. And then apparently what was being flashed on Big Ben by some sort of holographic projector were things like "ceasefire now, end the war."
Yeah.
So I guess
those protests were much more anti-Semitic back in the good old days. They're so cleaned up now. It's completely
back in the good old days, like 6 months ago or something. Well, listen, I've got David Shields here. He's an author who wrote a book called How We Got Here. It's not about Israel, Palestine. It's not about Galloway. It's about the entire path of Western history all the way up to this moment of fake news and Trump. It's coming out soon from us. He has a movie out as well on Tubi and Roku and other streaming services. So I want to bring him on to talk about Trump, but you guys should stick around, and we're going to do a parrot room if you have time in just a little while. Do you both have time, or what do you think? It's okay if you can say no if you have somewhere to be, James or Alfie.
I actually do, unfortunately, but I'll come back anytime in the future.
Okay.
Make Rochdale great again.
Great to come in, but yeah, I might still be here for the power room. But yes, I'll listen to Dave for sure. See you soon.
All right, so see you, James. I'm going to remove you. Oh, wait. Okay, and here's David. Yep, here's David Shields. And David, what did you make of that conversation about Galloway? If you have any comments on that, but then now we're going to change topics, transition over to talking about Trump.
Right. I mean, it was fascinating to hear some of it. I wasn't fully listening to the whole conversation, but so interesting, the parallels and differences between our countries. And I don't know, it was terribly I'm trying to think of just these endless parsing of the nuances of what constitutes anti-Semitism, what constitutes social conservatism. I'm trying to think of anything. I don't know if I have anything to say particularly other than just how carefully both of those guys, I think Alfie and James, that they're, we're all, even though they're, we're all trying to figure out what to say that's useful and new, but doesn't overstep some line. I don't know. It was fascinating. Just in a way, it does get us to Trump a bit, because I was just terribly interested in how people were using language, even your American accented English versus their, British accented English that we speak. It's that Twain line that two countries divided by a common language, and
right.
And that, that I don't know what I'm saying other than all we have as human beings is language. That's all we have to distinguish us from animals. And that basically you guys were talking, but there were these tiny nuances of difference between English and American, between what can be said and what can be implied. Basically, all the meaning is underneath the surface. I guess I'm focusing right now on this incredible moment in, I think it was Obama's first presidential campaign, where remember that Reverend in Chicago, was his name Jeffrey
Reverend,
Wright?
Jeremy Reverend Wright. Yeah, I
I
remember
forget his first name. It's not
Mhm.
Jeffrey, who's an actor. I think it's an actor named Jeffrey Wright. But
Was it Jeremy?
I mean, you can maybe Google
I'll look it
if
up.
you want.
I'll Google it up.
Reverend Wright in Chicago.
Mhm.
What is his first name?
Jeremiah.
There you go.
Jeremiah
You were
Wright.
close. Anyway, this is an incredibly interesting and instructive moment. I hope I am remembering it right. But at the time, Obama's assistant press secretary was a fellow named, I believe, Joe Gibbs. Is that correct? There's also a football coach named Joe Gibbs, but I think this guy was named Joe Gibbs. And anyway, he appeared against Fox News in the Obama campaign's understanding, was trying to tar Obama with guilt by association, that you attended, 12 sermons by Jeremiah Wright. And so you too are guilty of a kind of, I don't know what, balkanization of the races, or you too are full of hatred in Fox News's estimation of hatred of white people, or you are a kind of closet Muslim, or possibly, a follower of Malcolm X or something. And so Joe Gibbs, instead of arguing the case against that idea, saying, well, he's capable of attending a sermon, but not agreeing with everything he said, he started tarring by association the Fox News hosts. I forget who they were, various people, but he would basically, say, you attended this party and that means you two are, and so he was basically doing guilt by association, but instead of using it as words, he was actually doing the thing, if you see what I mean. Rather than saying, oh, gee, you can't say that Obama is guilty by association. That's not an American principle. He actually portrayed it. He actually dramatized it. And Fox News said, you're just tarring us with guilt by association. And then Gibbs had him and he goes, exactly. That's exactly what you're doing with Obama. And that, and it was a really, I mean, you could argue all the issues, but it was really good theater. It was really well done. And at that, and the following day, if I have my facts right, which I think are approximately correct, Obama elevated him from assistant press secretary to lead press secretary. And it's, to me, the essence of what politics is, that you do the thing, that you don't say the thing. And I think, I don't know how I got from, George Galloway, but it's sort of like, it really interests me as an instructive moment, because I don't think Gibbs was always that good by any means, but it's all in the symbolic and theatrical substance of it. And it's only very partly the actual words. And I think it's crucial in understanding Trump and Biden.
David, can I ask you a question about the poster behind you?
Sure.
It's Lynch, A History. And that's a film that you made about not David Lynch, but Marshawn Lynch, the football player, right? And I saw you get interviewed about this movie. I haven't seen the movie yet, but I
really would ask you to watch it, because I think you'll see, Doug, it's a surprisingly political movie. And again, you've got a lot of things to do, and you'll see its relevance to our current conversations.
Well, what I remember you saying in your interview was that the reason you really liked Marshawn Lynch was because of his silence and his resistance to the media as a football star. And you compared him to Bartleby the Scrivener, whose main line was, I would prefer not to.
Yeah.
And I feel like with Alfie and James, my role was to try to be a little bit like Bartleby, not to
Right.
not to condemn, but just to, like, press by saying, I would prefer not to. This, no, not this,
Right.
not enough.
I know you were very good, because you're more conversant with contemporary British politics than I am, but that you're probably not going to be as tuned in to every nuance of every
No.
Guardian article the way that they are, or the different neighborhoods of a particular
No, I had to look
province.
up. I had to
I
look up
know.
the demographics and all that before I talked to him.
And but I could basically follow it. There are such strong American equivalents in
Right.
which, this whole idea of him, Galloway being I don't know if you can do that anymore. It used to be, in 1887, you could tell Wisconsin something, but tell Pennsylvania something else. But of course, because of the rise of electronic media and the web, you can barely take a shower without having that broadcast worldwide. And so that's interesting to me if people thought Galloway was saying, to me, it was interesting during, again, I go back to Obama, his presidency, when he was in the South with, say, a largely Black population in the audience, he would fascinatingly drop his G's and he would fall. He is, as we know, biracial. He had a Black father and a white mother. And the way in which Obama would play the musical instrument of his voice, when he was around a Black audience, he would definitely, you might say, show a little bit more of, you might call it sort of African-American music and tonality and syntax and articulation. He just would. And if he's speaking to a fundraiser in the Bay Area, he's playing, the University of Chicago law professor. And that's interesting. That's fascinating to me how that happens, because if you go too wide, it becomes mockable and laughable. Like this football coach from Notre Dame who suddenly became the football coach at Louisiana State University. And the first day he was there, he started talking like, somebody from Hee Haw, and people just said, what are you can't do this. Like, there's no art to it.
Right.
You got to have what the Italians in the Renaissance called sprezzatura, the art that hides art. And I think, and going back to Marshawn Lynch a little bit, this is, I don't want this to be, product placement, but there was an amazing line that Marshawn Lynch's mother said, that Marshawn was, he's just unbelievably his father left the family and was convicted of drug possession and was in jail. I'm not sure he's still alive. And Marshawn dropped his father's name, took his mother's name. There's an amazing line where Marshawn talks about how his father would always say he would be there for him and just kind of skip town. And his mother was always there for him. And there's a wonderful line in the movie in which Marshawn's mother says, "Don't say the thing, be the thing." And I was basically paraphrasing her 5 minutes ago when I was talking about Joe Gibbs. He kind of said the thing, but he was the thing. He was tarring them by guilt, by association. And when they fell into his verbal trap, he pretty much had them. And that was very artful political theater. And I think that we see that, to be honest, relatively little from the center and center left of the Democratic Party. And I do think maybe, I think it's really fascinating to me. Why is somebody like, in a way, I'm kind of a theater critic. I'm not a political philosopher. I'm not a political pundit, but I'm almost like a dance critic or a theater critic who's really interested in the symbolic theater of the next 8 months, of like what's going to happen on November the 5th. A lot of it is about theater. Some of it, a little bit's about policy, a little bit is about vice presidential candidates, a little bit about, economic indices. But if we're on, this Iowa voter during the primaries who said about Trump, "I see no one out there who can be my savior other than Trump." That's quite a statement. And I don't, you couldn't imagine someone saying that about Biden. It would be ludicrous. And I just think that's a really interesting.
Has there been a Democrat in your lifetime, or even in the last 100 years, that someone might have said that about? That this person's, maybe the Kennedys had that kind of commitment.
Right. They did. Savior is obviously dripping with religious imagery.
Yeah, every Republican gets to be the savior. George
know.
W. Bush was the savior.
I
for
mean, I
these
think
ideologies.
Obama clearly had a little bit of that
Yeah.
vibe. I think the best moment I have, I think it's from Todd McGowan's book, a book that you published, Enjoyment, Right and Left, that I just, as you know, and as Todd knows, I absolutely love that book. And that if there's a moment, I think it's in that book. I've read a lot of Todd's books, but he talks about a crucial moment, which is FDR, I think, was the last person that the left would see as a savior, I think. And there's a moment where FDR is accused by the right of packing the court or creating, God forbid, the New Deal or Social Security. And, all this, he was really reviled from the center and the right, even though he was a child of the wealthy, came from a very prosperous family, as you know. And there's this crucial line that Todd quotes of FDR's. He says, "I welcome their hatred." That's savior-like because it's digging it. It's what Todd would call, after Lacan, enjoyment. He was getting pleasure in the push and pull of politics, of saying, like, fuck you all, bring it on, motherfuckers. And like, there's such guts in that. And FDR is probably in a wheelchair by then, but he says, I welcome their hatred, is really kind of Trumpian in its rhetoric. And like, it's hard to think of the last, who after FDR, maybe LBJ briefly, I don't know. Just the sheer, like, what we, for lack of a better word, ballsiness of that is the last savior-like utterance. And then
I think you're right.
It's an amazing, I don't know if you can unpack it further.
Trump
I think
does it. Trump does
he really does. I mean, that's so Trumpian. I welcome their hatred. He says that virtually daily.
And you know what? I'm going to make that my new mantra. I'm going to get that knitted, or I'm going to hang it on the wall next to Home Sweet Home.
I like it. I mean, I think going back to Marchand a little bit, I showed the movie like a few years ago in New York, and a former critic of, I think her name is Laura. I don't know why. I can't believe I'm forgetting her name right now. It'll come to me. But she was like a critic of downtown art. She wrote for the Village Voice. She's a very smart critic of performance art, people like Laurie Anderson and Eric Bogosian, Sandra Bernard, Spalding Gray. And she was a really good articulator of that movement. And she's become a friend. Anyway, she came to the screening and she saw Marchand as being very much like those performance artists, downtown New York performance artists of the 80s. And she said their key lines were, let's see if I can recall, something like, never show love and never show, I wish I could remember it. It shows up in How We Got Here movie, but she basically said Marchand was the perfect embodiment of that performance art. I'm embarrassed I'm forgetting it, but never show that you want attention, never show that you're hungry for love, and never show neediness. And I've sort of mangled it, and I can try and find it.
That sounds like good advice for a performer of all types, but certainly
exactly.
Yeah.
And then I think it goes to Marchand's brilliance that he's never earnest or sincere or trying to be a crossover artist. He's like radically himself. And I think, again, it's a bizarre comparison, but Marchand wore a lot of anti-Trump t-shirts during 2016. Their politics are hugely different as Marchand has tried to rebuild Oakland through economic revitalization. But there's some weird connection between Marchand and Trump, because I released the Trump book in, I think, 2018 and the Marchand film in 2019. And what is it that Trump does that is sort of related? I think he's terribly vulnerable, terribly needy, terribly broken, but he presents as not earnest, not sincere, like this whole thing that you and I wanted to talk about, which is cognitive decline.
Oh, yeah.
Biden seems, I don't know. What's your take on?
Look, I'm going to just this will maybe expose the fact that I have that I'm a dirtbag leftist at the very best. That I look at Biden and I look at Trump, and I just think Biden seems like he's suffering from some significant cognitive decline, and Trump Trump does not seem to be suffering quite in the same way, and not markedly in a way that I would say is worse than 2016. He was kind of incoherent even then, but he would power through. So I would say he was inarticulate in 2016, but he wasn't confused. And now I would say the same thing, that he's, although there's the time that he confused Nikki Haley for, see, now I'm going to do it.
And Nancy Pelosi, I think.
Pelosi, yeah. See, I wasn't going to bring Nancy Pelosi's name to mind, so I'm in cognitive decline.
I know, as we get, I know, and I think I would have agreed with you until I watched. I think I'm mangling his name. There's a guy named, he has like 1 million followers on Instagram or something, but his name is something like Ben Meiselis, and he's a lawyer in LA, and he ran this video. It's really good. I would have agreed with you 100% till yesterday when I watched this Meiselis analysis of a Trump speech a few days ago in South Carolina, and he kept stopping it every 20 seconds or so and showing, there's in this South Carolina speech, Trump maybe 30 or 40 times just is talking complete nonsense, not just like in a Trumpian word salad, but really just saying, I mean, you'll have to watch it, and maybe that we could watch the clip and analyze it together ourselves. But like, where he'll say something like, he's trying to say, I think, well, for instance, he's trying to say the word migrants, and he says something like, he says something like mariachis or something. Like, it's just, there's no connection whatsoever.
Wow.
Even and that there really does. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, I do agree. Like, for me, what's key about Trump is that his whole demeanor is triumphant. Like, it's built into his name, Trump. Like, he's like, even though he's, you'll have to watch the South Carolina speech and maybe Meiselis's deconstruction. Because he speaks in a constant river of word salad, just mashup, it's like a language from the future built entirely of broken synapses, to quote somebody's article I read one time.
Yeah.
That even if he does, he just powers through it, as you say, in this weirdly confident manner. And Biden, and I think this is something where, I do think it doesn't get talked about enough. I was thinking of writing a whole book about it. As you probably know or can tell, I grew up with a bad childhood stutter and still have vestiges of it sometimes. And I think Biden's stutter has formed his personality in really significant ways. Not only the fact that, there's this thing one learns in speech therapy is don't avoid a difficult word. The more that you do what's called a circumlocution around a word, all that does is build a muscle memory of your own fear. So, like, let's say I have a trouble with the word umbrella, and I try to be funny and say bumbershoot because I don't want to stumble on the word umbrella. But the more that you do that, the more you build up a kind of fear cycle. And I think Biden does that to a remarkable degree. He's constantly doing a little side route around a word that he's having trouble with as a, whatever you want to call it, kind of a recovered stutter, or someone who's gained relatively good control of my stutter, but who in a way still has, the vestiges of a stutter. I can tell immediately. It's almost like an alcoholic who can tell another alcoholic. Biden, I do think it deeply affects the way that we read him, because you pile on the cognitive decline with the stutter, and he just seems like, nervous Nelly. I forget that cartoon character who had a stutter. Was it Bugs Bunny, I guess? Like, he just seems very like on edge. And I think it was a terribly interesting moment in 2016 debate. Trump decided, I'm going to go really heavily after Biden and say stuff like, spit it out, Joe, can't you talk? Clearly trying to get him to stutter on a national stage. And Biden impressively stayed relatively calm, but there was a concerted effort, a classic kind of, you know, school bully attempt to try to see if Biden could stutter badly, like, but, you know, like if he really had a bad stutter, I think Trump thought that would be what my lawyer would call dispositive, but that was an interesting moment. I don't know if you're.
We need to go to the parrot room soon here, David. But I think it's been a very fascinating conversation. Of course, I want to keep you around for the second half, and I also wanted to let you know that I've started putting out a Sublation newsletter through Substack. It's not, you don't have to pay for it or anything. It's just a free newsletter to let people know what we're doing. And the first one says, David Shills and Jack Ross return to the channel with podcasts on the subject of Alan Bloom's Straussian book, The Closing of the American Mind, and Jack Ross's history of the neoconservatism and Trotskyism. So anyway, I want you to know, David, that publishing your book is going to be guiding the whole project. Like you're going to be, so we have to talk about Alan Bloom soon. People should watch for that conversation and video in the future, and watch for your book, which is, I have a new cover for it. We should talk.
Oh, but, good. Thank you. And when is that conversation again? Remind me, Doug, is it the 29th?
No, the 29th is we're releasing your film, the 30 or the 29-minute clip from your actual movie. So I don't know. We're going to have to do it sooner than that. We're going to have this conversation sooner than that.
Anyway,
and people who are watching still, go to the parrot room. We'll be answering questions. And David will be there. Alfie will be there. And we'll talk some more about Galloway and Trump. See if the degree to which they're similar and to the degree to which they're not. So yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. I'm going to run the outro, which is the same as the intro.
In the case of nuclear or radiological